Welcome everyone to this event on the US election and US sanctions. This is the second part of a series that we're doing at the Center for Financial Crime and Security Studies at RUSI, looking at the US election and various issues of financial crime and security. And today, of course, we're looking at the implications of the US election on US sanctions policy. My name is Emil Dahl. I'm a senior research fellow at the Center for Financial Crime and Security Studies at RUSI, where I focus on sanctions. And before introducing today's panelists, we'd like to launch a quick poll of everyone who's on the call today to find out where everyone is dialing in from. The poll is anonymous and should be on your screens now. While the poll is running, I will just go over some quick housekeeping rules. We are on the record for this webinar, and we will divide up the webinar as follows. We'll have about 30 minutes of discussion between the panelists, and then we'll have 30 minutes for question and answers from you, our audience. Please feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And please feel free to start submitting those questions during the panel discussion and upvote any questions that you like and would like to see answered. If you experience any technical issues, please make sure you address those in the chat function, where someone from the RUSI support team will be able to help you out, hopefully. Great, so I'll just keep the poll open a few more seconds, and I think we can end the poll there. Thank you very much. I'd like to introduce today's panelists, and they should be joining me on screen now. First up, we've got Elizabeth Rosenberg. She's a senior fellow and director of the Energy, Economic and Security Program at the Center for a New American Security, and she was formerly a senior advisor on financial and energy sanctions in the US Department of Treasury from 2009 to 2013. I've also got Nicholas Turner, who is a counsel with Steptoe & Johnson in Hong Kong, and also very recently a RUSI Center for Financial Crime and Security Studies Associate Fellow. I believe this is your first event as an Associate Fellow with us, Nick. He specializes in economic sanctions and is the author of a widely read sanctions newsletter. And finally, we've got Dr. Sascha Lohmann from SWP, the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. He's an expert in transatlantic sanctions policy and US foreign policy. So I've got some really great panelists with me today. And I think if I were to explore this issue of US sanctions, these are the people that I would invite to speak on it. So I'm, of course, very, very pleased that they've been able to join us today. So for everyone's awareness, we can see that we've got the majority of today dialing in from the UK, 64%, a good chunk from Europe and from North America. And I think that is a testament to the interest in US sanctions policy that are particularly taking place in Europe. Transatlantic sanctions policy has been a feature of the past and will likely be a feature of the future when it comes to US sanctions affecting Europe. So let's get started with today's event. I think it's no understatement to say that sanctions have become one of the, if not the most preferred foreign policy tool of the US government. In the last decade, in particularly, we've seen a more prominent role for sanctions in the foreign policy toolkit of the US government. But in the last 4 years in particular, you've seen President Trump taking on new sanctions priorities such as Venezuela or re-energizing old ones like Iran. And I don't think a week has gone by in the last 4 years where we haven't heard about sanctions this or sanctions that. And of course, this is coming from both the White House and Congress, and we hope to explore both. So to start, I know we're talking about the implications of the US election looking forward on sanctions, but to start, I'd like each of our panelists to reflect on the last 4 years of US sanctions policy. And perhaps if you could highlight one trend that you want to highlight as best describing the last 4 years of US sanctions policy. Liz, why don't we go to you first on that question?
Thanks so much, Emil, and thanks to Rusi for organizing this conversation. It's always a pleasure to have a chance to speak with my fellow panelists as well. It's actually difficult to choose just one, so I'll try to go with a big umbrella one. And if I may, perhaps in the context of the conversation, I could come back with another one later. But to begin with, I'd like to point out the trend of sanctions being a more prominent, intensive instrument of foreign policy. And it's not that they weren't meaningful, even quite significant in certain areas of US policy previously. But what we've seen in the last several years is that the scope for sanctions has become broader. There are more objectives that sanctions seek to try and advance. We often see their use more often, the frequency, you were just alluding to that, Emil, going after bigger targets. Secondary sanctions are standard. The stakes are even greater. Some of our friends and colleagues who work in this field have opined before that the ceiling had become the floor, but actually I think that's an understatement. I think basically the last several years have just blown the roof off. So that is to say there's a really powerful, expansive trend in use, targets, scope, etc.
Right, Nick?
Well, I agree with everything that Liz said. And I think the one trend that I would probably highlight is the type of targets that are being selected. Not only targets like the International Criminal Court, which is an escalation of sorts in the unilateral nature of US sanctions, but also the size of corporate targets that are being selected. So you'll remember that Rusal was on the SDN list for a while. That's a listed company here in Hong Kong. XPCC in China most recently, which is an enormous company. And I think the impact that that has, from my perspective, advising clients, is you notice that as these targets change and as they get bigger and as the targets are increasingly large companies which are integrated into the global economy or into particular sectors, companies are having to choose. And there is no longer an easy answer where you might say just no. Sometimes the answer is maybe. And it requires companies to look at these sanctions more carefully, to understand the nature of US enforcement jurisdiction, and to try to make decisions to retain commercial relationships if possible. And I think that is a trend that's new, particularly in Asia, but I think it's one that's growing, and I think it's going to continue to create a divide.
Right, Sasha, finally over to you.
Yes, Emil, thank you very much. And thank you to Rusi for setting this up. And thanks for my fellow panelists. If I were to choose one trend, I would pick the increasing use of secondary sanctions during the last 4 years, which target non-US persons and which not only act as a force multiplier for primary sanctions, but also increasingly come in flavor of standalone measures. So, for example, Nord Stream 2 or the oil sanctions against Iranian exports. They were enacted during the last 4 years, mostly by statute. So we think about Syria, we think about Russia, we think about Iran, and most recently China with respect to Hong Kong and the DPRK. But they also come slightly less frequently in the flavor of executive orders within these so-called material support provisions. And one important aspect of this trend actually with respect to secondary sanctions is that they are frequently coupled, and even more frequently during the last 4 years, with primary sanctions. And after the US election, given this trend, I think compliance challenges for private businesses will certainly be continuing a major issue within this discussion, and also creating certain legal minefields with respect to Hong Kong. But if we put this trend in a historical perspective, I think especially the OFAC is coming back to its historical roots as an agency of economic warfare. So even though we might perceive these trends, as Liz pointed out, as kind of increasing with respect to scope, I think institutional-wise, we're coming full circle here.
Great, thanks so much. Really, really fascinating. I think I would agree. There's been a lot of media reporting almost talking about the overuse of US sanctions in the last 4 years, that they're being thrown at every single problem. And the International Criminal Court was already mentioned. But we're seeing this sort of trend that almost US sanctions are being accused of being overused. So before we move into looking at what might change if we have a new administration, let's first talk about, even though the opinion polls are currently not pointing that way, as we saw 4 years ago, things are never done until all the results are in. So we'll know on November 3rd who will be the winner. But let's just think about a Trump 2.0 administration first. Some of the trends that you've highlighted here, do you think that we've seen the height of what Trump will do on sanctions, or do you think there is more to come? We've only seen the beginning of what we can expect to see from the Trump administration on sanctions. Anyone who wants to jump in on that, feel free. Nick.
I think the sky's the limit. I think we're just seeing the beginning. I don't think there's any reason to think, based on the data available, that we wouldn't see an acceleration in each of these trends.
And any particular country regimes that you feel are kind of unexplored? Because there are also instances like Venezuela where what's left for Trump to sanction, other than putting a comprehensive economic embargo on the country. I was wondering if there are any particular countries that we feel he hasn't explored enough sanctions on that area yet.
Well, I think you could remember that in the beginning, when John Bolton was still a part of the administration, he liked to use the phrase troika of, what was it, troika of tyranny. And that was for Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, if I'm not mistaken. And I think we would continue to see perhaps a development along those lines, because the Venezuela program, it's not just Venezuela. There's an Iran component now. There's a Russia component. There's a Cuba component. And I think we would continue to see the connections between other countries explored, and the sanctions targeted more and more at trying to carve away at international support for certain countries.
Liz, do you have any on this?
Yeah, I'll come in and add, we shouldn't restrict ourselves to thinking that they might target further countries. I think, Nick, you mentioned the ICC sanctions, right? So we could also be looking at sanctions that are designed to go after other kind of non-state, multi-state institutional actors. And one thing I would also just point out is that I think it's very well and good to have this conversation about sanctions and where they're going. But if we take just one step back and look at the broader arc of US economic measures designed to advance foreign policy goals, sanctions are about one piece of that broader, one tool in that broader toolbox. And one thing I think I would expect to see if Trump is reelected and has a second term is that, in fact, sanctions will be seen in a broader, variegated picture here, where I think they may not be the most prominent, aggressive instrument of foreign policy to advance national security interests and U.S. international strategic competition and foreign policy goals. There's been, as many of you and the people participating today will know, a real explosion, to me, actually even more notable at times, in the use of commerce authorities, for example, including to advance many of the same goals that US sanctions are designed to advance. It's sort of the BIS entity list has become kind of a cousin to sanctions, and I think that will grow in magnitude, which may actually make sanctions look perhaps a little more modest in an accelerated version of all of these tools.
Yeah, interesting to have this family kind of discussion with respect to all of these different agencies. But if we were to look in the crystal ball of a potential second Trump administration, one thing I could surely expect is a further push to designate central banks, for example, because here in Europe we always discuss, you know, since Nick mentioned the sky's the limit, people here think that central banks are still somehow sacrosanct and are not prone to be targeted. But I certainly, if you look at Iran, for example, and Venezuela, where this already has happened, I think this is certainly a route. And then secondly, sanctions as a way to legitimate or to provide legitimacy for more kinetic options, I think is another possible route of how to construe this aggressive use of sanctions. Since then you can argue, you know, you have basically exhausted all these options. Total embargo, if you enforce sanctions by maritime enforcement, that's kind of a small step to more kinetic engagement. And I think that's a slippery slope for more kind of military intervention as well.
And perhaps quite ironic, since sanctions were have long been seen as an alternative to military force. And actually, if military force are then used to enforce sanctions, that's certainly interesting. Great, thanks so much. So let's think about if Trump is indeed not re-elected. I know that there's a lot. Biden won't come into office on November 4th. There is a period between the election and the inauguration of Joe Biden, and indeed a new Congress who will also have a say on sanctions. And Nick, I know you wanted to talk a little bit about the things that an outgoing president can do to constrain an incoming president's choices, and what that sort of tells us about the nature of presidential powers in general when it comes to sanctions. So even if Trump's not re-elected, there's still some stuff that he can do that will influence the next 4 years of sanctions policy.
Right, that's exactly right. And I think this might be a good time to introduce one of the stars of the show, which is Aipa, or the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which is getting a lot of attention in the courts recently. And I think we'll talk a lot about that today. Aipa is a law which has been around since the late 70s. And it basically provides the president with the closest thing I think you'll get to a blank check to create sanctions virtually out of thin air in response to a national emergency or a threat emanating in whole or in part from outside of the United States. It's an extremely flexible law, allows the president to regulate trade in all sorts of ways. There are limitations, but they're few. And it is the basis for most OFAC sanctions. So whether we're talking about the International Criminal Court, or we're talking about Magnitsky sanctions, or Hong Kong sanctions, WeChat, or TikTok, these are all orders which are coming partly or entirely out of Aipa. And because of that flexibility and that blank check, so to speak, a president who is leaving office, let's say, would have the ability to create new programs in that brief amount of time, would have the ability to designate new targets and to lock in targets that maybe were under consideration but hadn't yet been announced or sanctioned. And, you know, from a diplomatic point of view, to kind of set the stage, you know, whether it's China or other countries for, you know, issues that an incoming administration would have to deal with from day one. The other thing is that these emergencies terminate after 1 year unless they're renewed. And what we did see with the Obama administration in the week before Trump's inauguration, there were a series of executive orders for several sanctions programs that more or less extended those programs for additional time They would have expired in January, February, or March of 2017, but they were extended. Now that may have been done maybe as a courtesy to prevent those from expiring while the new administration was getting its act together, or it may have been calculated in order to extend those programs so that they wouldn't have terminated so early. But in one of those instances, which was Russia-Ukraine, by extending that through the next year, it allowed time for Congress to pass CATSA, which was a sanctions law which locked in place the Russia program and basically took away that blank check from the president so that those could not be terminated easily. And so that was an instance where the outgoing administration set the stage for Congress to take an act that really bolted some sanctions into place for the long term. So we could see all kinds of things happen in the event of a change.
Great, Liz, do you want to come in on this as well?
Yeah, I wanted to take a moment just to underscore something Nick just said. You did that so artfully that it sounded as though the President Obama and Congress worked hand in glove to bolt those sanctions in place. And perhaps that's one telling of it, but you could you could tell it differently and say the Obama administration had one view and they acted in line with their view to put in place those measures at the end of their administration. And a different story, which happens to interact but is distinct, is that the US Congress, shortly after President Trump came into office and, if you will, began to sort of show his hand about his policy proclivities towards Russia, took their own action, which, as you note, and regardless of whatever they thought about how appropriate or well-suited or intense or inadequately intense Obama's policies were toward Russia, they nevertheless created CATSA, which, for what it's worth, started out as an Iran bill, but anyway, became best known for its Russia title and the Congress intent on fastening in place the sanctions body of law as it existed then with respect to Russia. And that's something that's really important to remember for a different reason, which is that Congress acts on its own, regardless of what the president wants. Now, it's not the implementer in the way that the administration is, but it creates lots of authorities. In fact, in the relatively recent past, it's been, and notwithstanding the intense partisanship and division and just the slower pace of work with regard to the pandemic virus, Congress has nevertheless been intensely focused on certain areas of sanctions policy, and they've gotten a lot done on sanctions policy. So that should also serve as a really important reminder that Congress has its own views on what should occur with regard to sanctions, both on style and on substance. So you were just, Nick, talking about the substance, but there's a style point here that's important, and I'm sure Sasha will have thoughts on this, which is to say that in general terms, and this is not a partisan issue, but in Congress, there's quite a lot of international sentiment toward coordination with foreign partners and allies. So I think in 2020, we saw the biggest yet bipartisan delegation of members of Congress to the Munich Security Conference. And there is a very large, important sentiment in Congress toward international communication and certain kinds of coordination and having their say in the conduct of US foreign policy. So that is to say, whoever the next US president is, Congress will be its own body and act with its own sensibilities on style and on substance.
I think that's a really important point, Liz. We're also electing a Congress here. So Sasha, perhaps you can, if you want to jump in on that question.
Yeah, maybe just a quick rejoinder. Generally, yeah. I think you could perceive this, enhanced congressional oversight of the executive in terms of sanctions policy as a good thing. But I would caution a little bit, given that it might also be a kind of an outflow of this increased partisanship list that you also mentioned, given if you look at how Congress structured this Iran sanction relief oversight in 2016, I think it was, and then having the CATSA oversight model actually being adopted against the backdrop of this previous Iran example, showing the steep mistrust between the two parties in terms of, not trusting a president from the other party to provide sanction relief or to enforce congressional sanctions. So I think, whereas in general, congressional oversight and congressional engagement, especially in sanctions policy, could enhance its democratic legitimacy. On the one hand, I think on the other hand, it is more an outflow of this hyper-partisanship and mistrust between the parties that is undermining these, basic constitutional functions of the government.
Sasha, perhaps we can transition at that point. You've done a lot of work on EU-US sanctions relations over the last few years, both on secondary sanctions, particularly on Nord Stream 2 being based in Berlin. There's been a huge debate over Nord Stream 2. And I was wondering, from your perspective, how much of that, and Liz pointed out that now Congress has a big role in sanctions, and particularly on CATSA, you see really Congress driving this forward. How do you see kind of EU-US sanctions relations over the last 4 years? Has that been driven mostly by Congress or by Trump? And if it's driven by Congress, a Democrat-controlled Congress, would they necessarily take a different approach to relations with the EU? So Sasha, if you want to just quickly talk about that.
Yes, I mean, when it comes to Russia, it's certainly driven by Congress, and given the current president's mood toward Russia sanctions, I think this is kind of understandable. But on the other hand, here in Europe, people don't really differentiate between the two branches. So when you had this letter to these mayors of the two coastal towns with respect to kind of pending Nord Stream 2 sanctions in Congress in the NDAA for this year, there was this huge outrage about, the US government, and also a lot of kind of outpouring of almost anti-Americanism. And this kind of exemplified an already looming debate in Europe with respect to an increasing kind of opposition to how US sanctions are enforced with respect to Iran. So this relates to more primary sanctions, but also these, as they're labeled here, extraterritorial secondary sanctions. And I always try to kind of remind people here that from a US perspective, secondary sanctions are not extraterritorial. But regardless of how you stand on this issue, it kind of shows you this almost kind of, kind of habitual opposition that is growing towards US sanctions. And this has really undermined, I think, the basic preconditions for transatlantic coordination on sanctions. And this is certainly one of the obstacles even a future Biden administration has to overcome before they could kind of, connect to this transatlantic cooperation pre-2016.
Liz, you want to comment on this as well? If you want to keep it short, because we haven't actually talked about Biden at all yet, so I want to make sure we get to that as well. But a quick comment from you.
I think the point that Sasha just made about European views toward transatlantic coordination is really important. I'm going to set that aside for a second, because I wanted to respectfully disagree with the prior statement you had made about US policy toward Russia being driven from Congress. I don't see that as the case. In fact, what I see is, and I also respectfully disagree with the notion that there's a hyper-partisan divide in Congress about Russia sanctions. Instead, what I see is a good deal of actually bipartisan view toward Russia as a matter of foreign policy, and an interest in a policy and having a policy that is tougher than it is currently. However, that is cloaked by a deference by the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, to President Trump. And he has the power or authority to put on hold a number of bipartisan measures that would bring in tougher sanctions and other policy measures toward Russia that have not become enacted because this majority leader is so deferential to President Trump. And one reason to say that, and perhaps Emil, here's your transition to a different administration, is that if we have a different president who leans further forward in policy toward Russia, what that might do is, I believe, bring that president more in line with natural views of many in Congress as a bipartisan matter that have been stifled because of an overwhelming desire by Republicans in Congress to be deferential to Trump.
Right, and we'll return to Biden a bit more, but I want to give Sasha the sort of right to reply to that. But Sasha, if you can comment on the aspect of so Biden and Congress, the stuff that Liz just outlined.
Yes, kind of like some kind of more controversial discussions here. Yeah, I mean, of course, people always characterize sanctions policy as one of, the last remaining bipartisan issues in Congress. But if you look at how deeply distrustful congressional relations with respect to the two parties has been in terms of the Obama administration providing sanctions relief, and with respect to President Trump's handling and implementation of US sanctions, especially after the Helsinki meeting, I think there is a certain element beneath this, superficial bipartisan agreement that is really, the two parties not trusting the others, to kind of use this instrument in a way that furthers US national security interests. And I think this is kind of an interesting sub-current development that is not really on the radar yet, but I really see a potential of, partisan polarization infecting this kind of still, but maybe all too soon previously bipartisan, bedrock fundamentals of US foreign policy. And I think this is kind of the first, one of the first cracks, I would say, in this respect.
Nick, quick reply.
Well, I think this might lead into the next part of the conversation. So, Emil, I hope you don't mind if I zoom ahead a little bit. But, I think this discussion raises an important point, which is, the nice thing about Aipa, this law that gives the president that ability to create sanctions, is that the president, in theory, can cancel those sanctions with, one document, which it might be nice if, a new administration came in and changed some things that people thought, weren't done the right way. But actually, because of this consensus in Congress on a lot of these issues, and I'm thinking of China myself, I happen to be in Hong Kong, I don't think a new administration is going to have very many options. And even if we want to use an example like the International Criminal Court, there's a constituency there that likes what's being done. And I think any president has to be very careful in thinking about unwinding any of the things that the previous administration did, because there's going to be a group somewhere that's going to be favorable toward the old policy. This is one of the reasons why the Cuba sanctions are still in place, because there is a constituency that appreciates those sanctions and demand them. And I think when it comes to other areas of sanctions policy, China in particular, I think a new administration is going to have to pick its battles with Congress. And China sanctions is probably not a battle that an administration wants to have right away when the mood in the United States towards China is what it is. So I don't think, if I can jump ahead again and make a prediction about a Biden administration, I don't think we would see immediately a big shift in very many of these policies.
Great, thanks for that that shift, Nick. That's much appreciated. I see we now have a first question submitted in the Q&A box. I'll wait for a few more to come in, and we'll dive into those questions. So please, if you have any questions for our panel, now is your chance to ask them, and please ask away, and we will get to them. Liz, I want to make sure that I get your views on a possible Biden administration. Because I guess sitting in Europe, it's difficult to see what has kind of achieved consensus in Washington sanctions-wise, and there might be some of the stuff that Trump has done that's received kind of consensus status that Nick's referring to, and what priorities that Biden might be interested in and able to roll back on. I mean, my guess might be Venezuela, but over to you. I'd love to hear your views on that.
Well, I think one good place to start is to think about what's said by Vice President Biden as a candidate. And one good reason to think about that is because what President Trump said as a candidate, he's stuck to when it comes to pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal. And there were a number of people who didn't quite credit that or thought that maybe he had backed off on it because he didn't do it immediately when he came into office, but he stuck to his campaign promise. So when we look at what Biden has indicated, it does look like he's made strong statements about Iran policy and seeking to persevere with Iran with nuclear diplomacy, which would be a big change from the current posture. There's a lot of actors involved in that. He's also indicated cautiousness and a tough stance when it comes to things like nuclear security, China, counterterrorism, human rights, anti-corruption. Some of that is quite consistent with at least sentiment, sort of directionally similar to what current policymakers have articulated and implemented as a matter of policy. It really remains to be seen if, how intensity will match, exceed, pull back from the current status quo. And there's a lot of factors in play there. A place where there's divergence probably, in addition to what Biden has said publicly about his Iran policy, also goes back to that stylistic point I was making before. The kind of the whole approach towards international coordination is wholly different than what we've got right now. And I don't want to underestimate that or just set that aside as a non-critical issue. I think actually, because it's a real across the board matter for the Biden team, I don't mean just in sanctions, but in other areas of foreign policy or transnational challenges, that may go quite a long way with a whole variety of partners and allies, making certain kinds of coordination or cooperation possible, even in the world as we see it today, which is seeing nationalism on the rise everywhere and stress to multilateral institutions everywhere. So nevertheless, I think that may open up just really different stylistic approaches for if there is to be a Biden administration. And I just want to come back and say, because this feels really front of mind for the United States heading into an election, with anxiety about interference and misinformation and concern about whether the Russia policy is calibrated appropriately at present. I do think that will be an area for divergence, but just note that there are many people that share that concern, even if it is not coming directly from the White House right now, many policymakers that share that concern. So it is possible that we could get into a place of greater alignment across more constituencies in the foreign policy community if there were to be a Biden administration.
Asha, I know you want to comment on this quickly, and then I want to move to the Q&A. If you have a quick comment, that's.
Nick, do you want to go first, or should I?
Go right ahead.
All right. Well, I think what has been especially striking, I think, under the Trump administration is the actual lack of managing congressional initiatives with respect to sanctions. So when you look at the Nord Stream sanctions, for example, there was little pushback, I think, from the executive. If you compare it to, for example, Obama or even the Bush administration, they always and systematically tried to preempt sanctions by, issuing executive orders. I think Trump did it with the Magnitsky sanctions a little bit. But if you look at the really potentially crippling sanctions when it comes to Nord Stream, I think this really showed you the lack of managing congressional initiatives in this respect. And I think from this experience, Congress really learned its trade a little bit further, I think, when you consider it really started under the Obama administration when they put these crippling sanctions into the National Defense Authorization Act. And now this practice, I think, gets more and more support in Congress. And I think in the future, and that kind of affects a potential Biden administration as well, I think a future president will have more trouble with managing Congress in terms of, keeping this constitutional balance a little bit, balanced, so to speak.
I think there's a really interesting question that I want to dive into here in the Q&A. And of course, I think a defining feature of the Trump administration has also been its relationship with the UN, sort of the UN in general. But if we look at sanctions and the UN, on one hand, it has managed to get through some of the most comprehensive North Korea sanctions ever agreed by the UN, largely pushed by Nikki Haley and the Trump administration. But there's a question here referring to the now general rejection by the UN Security Council of a US snapback on Iran, and what that means for the integrity and coherence of the international sanctions regime. So I wonder if we can get some comments on sort of the US's interaction with the UN Security Council on sanctions, and whether that could actually undermine the kind of disagreements that we're seeing on Iran snapback right now, how that could actually undermine UN sanctions. Because as I see it, UN sanctions should be at the cornerstone. Those are sort of the internationally agreed, the sanctions that everyone buys into, at least in theory. So a comment on that. Nick, do you want to go first on that?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. I think the legal arguments that the administration has made with respect to the resolution and the JCPOA are really interesting. Does that mean, I guess my question is, the State Department, what they've indicated in their recent statements is that if countries don't go along with this, and say what you will about, if it's a fiction, if it's a legal fact, are the sanctions back in place? Well, if you ask the United States government, they're back in place. And, the indication is that if countries don't support that notion, that they could be subject to sanctions, that there could be, consequences. And I think, the answer to this question probably depends on whether or not that is true. If there's countries that don't put in place sanctions that had been lifted or that move forward, with arms deals, for example, I think that's the big one. How's the U.S. going to react to that? And does that become, a UN issue, or does it stay limited to an Iran issue that's happening in the UN? You know what I mean? And I think that will determine a lot. I think one thing about this administration is that they seem to have had no problem with moving ahead on things, without getting buy-in, from people that maybe traditionally you would expect to see buy-in from. And with the UN, I don't see that, ending at all. If this administration, has another go, I think under a Biden administration, I think they try to clean that up. I don't know if they would change their stance ultimately, but I think they try to clean this up, politically. Liz, I'd be interested.
Yeah. Liz, I wonder if you want to come in on this as well. And there's been a second question submitted in the meantime, which talks about prospects for a Biden administration for a shift in intensity on North Korea at the UN level. So if you can bring that into your answer as well, what prospects do you see for re-energizing North Korea sanctions at the UN?
Yeah, I think Nick made some really good points, and this is very challenging, and the United States will need to live with this legacy of what the Trump administration has just done to seek to snap back UN sanctions, regardless of how politics change in the United States. So that poses some logistical and administrative challenges, to state the obvious, and some political ones as well. And Nick, I think that was what you were alluding to say clean it up. But one thing I just point out is that none of us foresee a change to the fact that the United States and China will remain as major strategic competitors, and that the United States and Russia have experienced cooling and difficult relations. And one thing that means is that taking any measures, between the P5 will be finding points of agreement between the P5 will be incredibly difficult. And I do think that that will be a feature of UN activity going forward for the foreseeable future. And that would bear on Iran policy, certainly, and on other areas of policy as well. When it comes to North Korea, what we saw in the last two big UN Security Council resolutions with measures on North Korea was an action in response to a greater perceived threat or a catalyst, a provocation, right? That the international community was responding to. And for better or for worse, the cycle of international actions to tighten or expand sanctions on North Korea has really followed this pattern, sort of responsive rather than proactive to North Korean actions. So one thing we might do is look to North Korea and how it may provoke the international community or not to get at our answer about what will happen in the United Nations. I'm of the view that action in the Security Council on sanctions will be really difficult, as I was just mentioning about activity in the P5. I mean, that era of coordinated action has been over for a while now, but why say never that there might not be an issue on which all parties come together and want to find common cause. There are various substantive and political reasons why that could occur. So I don't know that North Korea is one thing I see, just as a last comment, when looking around with regard to North Korea, is that there's sort of wild and willful disregard to sanctions enforcement all over the world when it comes to UN sanctions on North Korea. So I'm not quite sure what it would mean to get religion and advance sanctions at the UN on North Korea now.
Thanks, Liz. So let's jump to another question. Sasha, this one's one I really want your views on. So with the overuse of US sanctions, there's also been a greater pushback from sanction states, but also from the EU. So how do you evaluate countries' progress on de-dollarization and EU attempts to use the euro more geopolitically, basically to avoid the kind of nexus to US sanctions and the long arm of the US sanctions enforcement agencies? How do you view that? And is that something that's likely to continue under any administration? Have those trends been get going and we can't stop them? What's your views on that?
Well, in a nutshell, I don't think that de-dollarization is the appropriate strategy to shield European companies from the reach of US jurisdiction. And I published on that. But to answer the question more generally, I think if you look at just what the Federal Reserve did during the pandemic, I think the demise of the dollar is not immediate. So de-dollarization usually, meaning independent payment mechanisms. If you look, for example, at Instex here in Europe, they could hardly find any banks processing kind of related transactions that you still needed. So I think there has been one transaction so far being cleared through Instex, and all these attempts at, kind of making European payments and therefore European entities more independent from the reach of US secondary and primary sanctions has been a failure so far. But as I said, it's not the appropriate strategy, because what we would need is not a greater kind of decoupling between Europe and the United States in terms of financial markets, in terms of markets more generally. But instead, what we need is a dialogue on jurisdiction, as it happened during the 1980s, for example, in the realms of antitrust. So they ended up with an agreement between the US Department of Justice and the then European communities on how to treat jurisdictional conflict within the realm of antitrust. And I think this is kind of, the only benign way, so to speak, diplomatic way to sort out these kind of issues, and not so much for Europeans to be more independent, because it's, as I said, kind of a long it's a long shot to replace the dollar, and all the signs, especially during the pandemic, point to the continuing dominance of this currency.
Great, thanks so much, Sasha. Don't know if Liz and Nick want to comment on that, but there's a great question or potentially controversial question that's come in as well. And I'm just going to read it out. It's excellently phrased. To what extent should states that have hugged close this administration, from Hungary to Saudi Arabia, to the UAE to Israel, expect a Biden administration to punish their excesses or make up for the previous 4 years with sanctions? I don't know who wants to take a stab at that one, but I thought it's been highly upvoted, so I thought we should do it. Any volunteers for commenting on that one? Sasha, you've put up your hand. Go ahead.
That was not intentional.
That was not intentional.
I can start.
Liz, yeah.
So here, this is anticipating a Biden administration. I mean, the biggest, most profound challenges for a Biden administration coming in will be the public health crisis, the economic crisis, a few key areas of foreign policy. When it comes to, I cannot see punishing specific countries that the United States has, tightened ties with, as whatever people may have a view on in an incoming administration. I cannot see that being high on the list amongst these just profound priorities that will dominate, to say nothing of, in the United States, a focus on racial justice and community equity issues, and dealing with an incredibly divided citizenry and electorate. This to me seems like a quite modest matter, even if people will, in the foreign policy community, will have views on it. So that's my immediate thought on that. And it will be an important area of policy, but perhaps a touch of a luxury to be able to have the time to course correct on a number of these bilateral relations that will come after some of the immediate, urgent triage work of a new administration.
Great, thanks so much. There's also a question, any ideas on what Biden's views would be in relation to Syria? We haven't talked much about Syria. Would he follow the current stance of the current U.S. administration, or we'd like to see a shift there? Nick, do you want to come in on that?
I think Syria is another one where Congress has shown a lot of consensus with the Caesar Act, for example. That has been implemented by the administration. Those are sanctions which are being used. And I would think that that focus would continue.
Great, thank you. We've got about 5 minutes left. We've got a lot of participants dialing in from the UK. A feature of 2020 has also been the UK rolling out its independent sanctions policy. And so far, we've seen quite close coordination between the UK and the UK looking more west towards the US and Canada for its partners on human rights sanctions, rather than to the EU. And recently on Belarus, we saw the UK moving ahead without the EU and actually coordinating with Canada, but the intent was initially to coordinate with the US. I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about Brexit, not to make every event about Brexit, but where do you see UK-US sanctions coordination going under a Trump administration, under a Biden administration, or indeed kind of in a Congress that's not controlled by the Republicans or by the Democrats?
Well, if I can start on that, I think the opportunity for the US in this situation is that the UK is now, I don't want to use the word free, is available to play a supporting role in sanctions and to help form small coalitions with other states like Canada on some of these issues. I think that the UK, its program is shaping up to be very impactful. I think the Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation is obviously getting down to business and people are paying attention. And I think that they probably will coordinate with the US. And I think that will be taken, I think it'll be welcomed in the US. And I think it'll be, an opportunity for international cooperation more than anything.
Something we've been looking at RUSI, we ran a UK sanctions task force over the last year and a half, looking at what the UK should do. And there was an interesting conclusion from that while the UK and the US has a special relationship on defense and security, that special relationship wouldn't necessarily translate as well into sanctions because of these areas of policy where outside of human rights sanctions, like Iran, the Iran nuclear agreement, where the UK and the US, and it's not in the UK's best interest to align itself with the US, but actually still looking back at Brussels. And I think we're seeing the start of a trend, and it's it's not even a trend yet. We're seeing sort of the inklings of the beginnings of what could perhaps become a trend, that the UK is able and ready to move ahead without the EU. And for me, that is problematic, because we used to have a quite direct, we used to have a seat around the EU negotiating table on sanctions. And I think the recent Belarus decision actually showed that the UK has lost that voice in the EU and has lost an important partner in the EU, not being able to bring the EU on board with sanctions, and is working with the US necessarily the best thing. Sasha, you want to come in on this? We've got 3 minutes left, so keep it short.
All right, just a quick take. I just want to pour some water in the wine here on potential UK-European coordination. If you think of sanctions having both instrumental purposes and expressive purposes, so instrumental is, behavioral change, strategic communication, but also this expressive purpose dimension is about, punishing others and conveying certain self-images. And I think here, especially Brexiteers and people who really want to kind of, demonstrate the independence of the UK could use and politicize this instrument of sanctions in terms of, using it more widely and in an unconnected fashion to the EU in order not only to portray their independence, but also to, make the case of the continued global relevance of Britain, even though if you look, empirically, this might not be the case in terms of material facts anymore. So I really see more danger than a potential collaboration here, but that all depends on how it is managed on the highest political levels, I guess.
Right, I think before that, the UK has obviously been quite a type labeled as a bridge builder between the US and the EU on sanctions. There's a question here that asks about whether the loss of a Five Eyes member inside the EU will affect EU-US sanctions alignment. I think that's yet to be seen, but right now there's no formal mechanism for a state to have a direct say in the direction of EU sanction strategy. The EU sanctions are the EU's decision to make it on its own. And the UK will have a role similar to that of the US, influencing from the outside, unless there is something put into a future agreement. Any last comments on that from anyone?
Well, maybe just a quick impression, so to speak. I think on a technical level, there's still so much trust between people working in the bureaucracy, and I think information sharing is going on this level. And I think it really depends on how, the political leadership is really handling this issue, whether it's politicized or not. But on a purely technical level, I think there still exist lots of channels and lots of working relationships that will continue in the future.
Great. I'm just having a final scroll through the Q&A list. I think we've got through the main themes. We have by no means addressed every single question. I apologize for that. We've gone through the main themes. There is one question that I just want to quickly fire over to you, Nick, because it references you by name, and it asks for the specific likelihood that a Biden administration would, one, end the ICC sanctions, and two, make greater use of the Magnitsky Act. And there's a note here that Nick mentioned this earlier, that there might be a resistance, but what's the actual likelihood of those things happening quickly?
Well, I don't think it's likely that they'll lift them right away, although enforcement might be lax. And I don't think we would see new designations under those sanctions. I think we'll see a lot more under the Magnitsky program.
Perfect. Great. So we've reached the top of the hour. I think this has been really, really fascinating, and there's so much to discuss when it comes to sanctions. And I think what's really clear is US sanctions is not just about the US. US sanctions is about its relations with the EU, now its relations with the UK. It's to do with intermingled with other foreign policy priorities of the administration. And crucially, US sanctions are not only decided in the White House, and actually the composition of the Congress will matter just as much, if not more, than who is elected president. That might offer some consolation to people who are fearful of what might be coming out of the White House from 2021 to 2025. But I think it's very much a watch this space, and we will certainly do that here at RUSI, where we will continue to do work on sanctions, both from a UK perspective on UK sanctions policy, but also future US sanctions and EU sanctions. Finally, I'd like to thank my panelists today, Liz, Nick, and Sasha. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure to host you. And then I'd like to remind everyone that we've got our next event on October 12th. So that's on Monday, on Dark Money and Democracy. Is There a Way Out? And that will feature Tom Keating, the director of the Center for Financial Crime and Security Studies, Edward Lucas, Gemma Rogers, and Josh Rudolph. So that should be an interesting event as well. And certainly elections and dark money has been a recurrent theme over the last few years as well. So really looking forward to that event. So without further ado, if you're not already signed up to the CFCS mailing list, please make sure you do so that you can be notified of all future events that we do. And you can also follow us on Twitter, where we are all very, very active, and we always talk about financial crime, sanctions, everything. So thanks so much to my panel, and thanks to everyone who dialed in today.